we're delighted to have a member of the UK Parliament who has developed quite the name for himself and quite the reputation as somebody who is a very ambitious champion for implementation of net zero commitments. So it's not about creating new targets and new commitments, it's about the focus is on implementation and delivery. So we have here the Honourable Chris Skidmore, Member of Parliament from the United Kingdom, who I think it was during the course of the last year and a half, Chris, you authored the Independent Net Zero Review for the United Kingdom, which has now been published as a book, Mission Zero. So this is the first of a number of events here in the pavilion where we're going to be inviting Chris to speak more to this. But because today's focus is very much on just transition, we thought that we'd get you up here to share some of the headline messages from this for the Just Transition agenda. So Chris, without further ado, welcome. The stage is yours.
Well, thank you, Malini, and thanks to Globe for this opportunity to speak to you today. I was the Energy Minister that signed sort of the net zero commitment the UK made into law over 4 years ago. If you told me then that 93% of the rest of the world's GDP would be under a net zero target of some form, I simply wouldn't have believed you. The progress has been immense and net zero has almost gone viral. But with that is an important recognition that these are just commitments. They're words on a page. And this particular COP, as a COP which we will be focusing on having a global stocktake, is critical in now evaluating those commitments to see whether they are worth the paper that they're written on. And we will recognise, unfortunately, that some of those commitments are not on track, that there are many countries that are not making the progress that is needed. And I think this is a challenge for how we frame the just transition also, because we must recognise that there are some countries through no fault of their own that are high carbon, the industries that produce the jobs that drive their economies, means that historically they will struggle to make the transition happen at speed and scale. And so then when it comes to the just transition, ensuring that we recognise the individual position each country is in and that we work together as a global community to help these countries is incredibly important. Now, how do we take forwards the global stocktake is one, I think, of the most important things I think that will come out of this COP. People ask me, what are you looking forward to? What are you waiting for? And obviously there's been so many announcements already that have taken place. But we will still wait to see what emerges in the global stocktake. What's the mechanism that's going to be created to not just hold countries to account, but again, to work to support them, to enable them to have this just transition towards clean and renewable energy. And the opportunity I've been given by the British government to lead the so-called net zero review that was mentioned, I think is also an opportunity for other countries to look at what the UK has done, to look at how it has analysed its own net zero commitment and recognise, this is a challenge. There are going to be hard to abate sectors. There are going to be sectors where we are still falling behind on agriculture, on transport, on industry, that we need to go further. And how do we remove the barriers that are in place in order to meet the ambition and the opportunity that's there? Because we can make the commitments to reducing emissions, but unless we're willing to be open and honest with ourselves about unlocking those barriers, about working with the communities that see these barriers as often the moments in their life which they earn a living, we're not going to have a properly just transition. So framing the just transition, I think, around identifying those countries that will struggle, those communities that will struggle, and working together with them is absolutely critical. And I think the most important thing to take forwards also politically as a politician is knowing that we can take decisions here at COP on an international stage, but we've got to get back home and sell these commitments or take these commitments forward to our own electorates. And if our electorate isn't willing to support this, then the politicians also then won't support the commitments that are made here. So it's absolutely vital that going forwards, that challenge is one where we identify how we can build in support for those communities and how we can demonstrate to them that these are changes that they are willing to support for the future. And that, I think, requires a reframing of how we do climate policy. We have departments, ministers, governments working on creating new policy frameworks. And obviously the challenge in the energy world is these are highly technocratic, highly detailed, highly scientific. I don't know whether Therese Coffey, former Environment Secretary, agrees with me, but it's very difficult as a minister when you're at the dispatch box to frame your arguments when so many of those have to be based in a scientific language. But we need to try to bring out that sort of the human context of why we're doing what we're doing. And then when it comes to this global stock take, as I said, trying to identify where countries are falling behind, identifying those countries that are falling behind as those that should be identified as part of a just transition from a point of abatement, of a point of being high carbon economies. Taking those policy frameworks forward, how do we give greater ownership to communities, to regions, to cities, to actually come forward with the ideas that might provide the solutions to some of those challenges? So when we did the Net Zero Review in the UK, I wanted to be the largest engagement exercise on net zero we'd ever conducted. Now maybe we should have done this first, before signing the Net Zero commitment into law, but at the time we were keen to be the first, and we beat France by one single day. Not that had anything to do with it, but there was a moment in time when we could legislate. So we took that decision. And as I said, if you'd asked me 4 years ago, I wouldn't have expected net zero to have gone viral in the way it has done. But we've come back to the commitment and look now at the detail of delivery and implementation. And the review, as I said, was the largest engagement exercise on net zero. We held 52 roundtables. At least 20 organisations, companies were on those roundtables. So 1,000 companies, ranging from industry all the way through to SMEs, through to local authorities. Each roundtable was themed in a way that meant that everyone who's involved in net zero had an opportunity to contribute. We also did a written call for evidence. I know we've just had a panel on the Environmental Audit Select Committee, but the model I took there from the Select Committee model we have in the United Kingdom, where you have a written call for evidence, and we received 1,800 written submissions from organisations, individuals from across the country. We also did a tour of the United Kingdom, because in the United Kingdom, energy policy is what's called a reserve matter, so it's up to the UK government to decide what decisions are made. But when it comes to decarbonisation and climate change policy, that's devolved. So Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland set their own separate policy frameworks from England. So Scotland has committed to net zero by 2045. If you look at Northern Ireland, it's 2055. England's in the middle at 2050. So I went to Northern Ireland, I went to Wales, I went to Scotland, again, to give people that sort of sense that they were being listened to and being heard. And I think that's what's really important now. If we're going to have a just transition, if we're going to have a global stock take that isn't just counting, but is then measuring and managing for the future, we've got to give people that sense of ownership. We've got to be able to create processes by which people will say, this is a policy framework that I signed up to. It wasn't just imposed on me. And I think that's a challenge for several countries. I was recently in Prague, and they have a challenge around the EU Green Deal being set by the Commission. To what extent this is being imposed on them, that's going to create potential political challenges for the future. So I think there's a real opportunity, and using the Net Zero Review as a template to say this is what the UK has done. This is how we embraced and engaged industry and business on net zero. There's also this challenge, I think, around the energy transition about how we create new ways of imagining change. How do we sell change to populations? And I can see a couple of countries in the audience where obviously you're living the change. Adaptation is as important as mitigation, recognizing that sea levels are rising, that the oceans themselves are becoming less diverse. But at the same time, recognizing for individual populations, issues around healthcare, around understanding the consequences of pollution, really are now coming to the fore. We know more now than what we did 10 years ago. There are calls in the UK to potentially bring forward new climate legislation, to bring forward ways in which we can legislate for adaptation as well as mitigation. So I wouldn't be surprised in the future. We've got our Climate Change Act in the UK, which has been this benchmark for the past 15 years. We're celebrating its 15th anniversary. We've had the Committee on Climate Change, which sets carbon budgets. So we know where we need to go. But even the challenge for the UK is we're going off track. So coming back to reassess where we are, where we need to be, and then not doubling down, but giving a more intensive approach to supporting those industries that need support, I think is really important. I think particularly industry is an area of focus where we haven't done enough in the UK. We've done a lot on identifying local clusters. And this, I think, is also really important when it comes to accountability, is we have national parliaments, as I said, we have regional governments, we also have regional mayors, city mayors, and we have local authorities. People trust their local authorities more than they do politicians like myself at Westminster. So really important, and the evidence that we took forward in the Net Zero Review shows, if you want to succeed in delivering, taking a place-based approach is really important. So identifying that, in the UK, for example, Manchester is going to be different from what's going to be happening in London, from what's happening in Birmingham. And that's the same, I think, for countries across the world. It doesn't necessarily have to be a single national policy. There are different template ways of getting to net zero, depending on the industrial footprint, the agricultural footprint of that region, of that community. And so coming up with area plans is really important. And that's where I think we've made the commitment. We now need almost to set out roadmaps that don't just look forwards, but actually what we need to is work backwards. You set the overall outcome, and then from that you can have a technology roadmap, you can have a behavioural change roadmap, where you are almost having these sort of gateposts of where you want to be, not just for 2050, not just for 2035, but not just for 2030. Understanding that in a fixed period of time, we should be setting ourselves ambitions, sectoral ambitions, but also place-based ambitions. And we have a really interesting sort of feature in the UK that lots of our local authorities declared their own net zero targets. They all declared a climate emergency, and now they've set targets that are more ambitious than 2050. And I'll end on this because I'm keen to get into a discussion. The worst thing you can do, I think, as a government or in politics, is to overpromise and underdeliver. That, I think, is the ultimate challenge for us all here at COP. We all come here wanting to achieve the best we can. But if we come here and overpromise and go home and underdeliver, that doesn't do anyone any favours here. It undermines the COP process itself. But most critically, it undermines in the eyes of those who we need to convince that the transition is in their interests. It undermines to our electorates that we don't have their best interests at heart. If we aren't able to keep our promises as elected representatives, we lose trust. And that's the most important thing when it comes to the transition. If we want to have a just transition, if we want to take sectors with us, we won't do so if we don't have trust. If we're not able to convince people that we are doing this because it's the right thing to do, not just for the climate, not just for our environment, but also for their future jobs, their future economy, and the future generations. So I'll end on that point because I don't want to sound unambitious. I don't want to sound skeptical. But I think it's important to keep in mind that we have a healthy realism about achieving what we need to achieve. Let's set out these milestones and let's deliver the mechanisms, but let's create the mechanisms by giving communities a sense of ownership over them. And as I said, the Net Zero Review for the UK government has now been 129 recommendations. The UK government's taken forward about 100 of these recommendations so far. I'm still keen to press on what was the overall vision of a mission. So creating a cross-party approach, but regardless who's in government, taking a 10-year framework to say, this is a long-term plan, these are the targets we set, and it doesn't matter which side of the House of Parliament you sit on, you'll commit to this long-term plan, this long-term outcome on a number of issues. Still yet to convince my own government to sign up to that. We have a general election next year, and I'm determined to make sure from our perspective in the UK that net zero and climate action remains at the top of the agenda when it comes to that election also. So thank you very much for the opportunity to address you today, and I'm sure we'll have a great discussion going forward.
so that we can have a discussion. And we've got the number of members of parliament here. If I can just start with a few questions, just to set the ball rolling. So would you characterize the net zero audit process that you initiated, that you ran, as the UK's stock take, national stock take? Because that's what we're talking about. We're talking about auditing action.
It didn't come out like that. That wasn't the purpose of the review to start with. The previous Prime Minister, Liz Truss, committed to net zero, and she said that she wanted to look at net zero, keeping the target in place, but how can we do this in a pro-business, pro-enterprise way? How can we make net zero pro-growth? And so she set me this opportunity to independently review our net zero journey. And at the same time, because we have our target set in law, this means that climate activists, Client Earth, Laura Clark's here, I think, are able to take the government to court if we don't meet our commitments. So there was a High Court judgment that the net zero strategy the government set in 2021 was legally deficient. And actually the government decided to use this review also to say, well, let's wait to see what the review's recommendations are, and we're going to then update our own strategy. So it came out of a twin-pronged approach in late 22 to both politically look at how we could win support for net zero from business and industry. How can we do so in a way that shows that net zero is not a cost, not a burden, it's an opportunity. And that was what the narrative was about, was really saying, look, even if there isn't a climate crisis, which there clearly is, we should be doing net zero and seizing this moment, recognizing that there are investment decisions being made across the world and that there's no turning back. Net zero is happening. And if we don't adapt, if we don't recognize this, we'll fall further behind. We're in a global net zero race. But actually, as a result of what's happened, the net zero review came out and it received wide support from both the climate community and also business and industry. So I saw this as an opportunity to really sort of say, well, the UK has come forward with other frameworks in the past that have been adopted internationally where this is a policy process which other countries could follow. And as I said, I've been to Prague to talk with the Czech government about how they could potentially do this. I've got a meeting with the French government to potentially also talk how they could take this similar process forward. And I'm here today to try and convince you also this might be a process that you might want to follow on the back of the global stock take that will obviously be published during this COP.
So, the reason I ask this is because in his opening address, on? It's good? Oh, it's not easy to hear me. That's better. Okay. So the reason that I ask is because in the opening address, the Executive Secretary of the UNFCCC, Simon Steele, he said, well, in terms of the UNFCCC's own innovations in response to a sense that it wasn't being transparent enough or holding parties to account for commitments made but not delivered. He said, well, there are two things to note. The first is that from next year onwards, we're going to require every party to issue a transparency report. And the second is, of course, that in 2025, we have the next version, the next iteration of nationally determined contributions, which must be delivered. And there is a ratcheting up principle within Paris. So you cannot regress backwards because of non-retrogression. You have to continue to move forward. So actually, the innovation that you've made helps with that, continually reviewing and moving forward. But there is a catch there, because you mentioned that as part of your process, you went across the country. You sought to solicit feedback, which could then inform improved policy making, firstly, and secondly, to secure public support. Now, there are countries, we heard from South Africa this morning, which is they have a climate bill before the upper house, in which they did the reverse of what the UK did. They went to the people first. They had a process of consultation, they consulted, and then they put together the climate bill, which is very much focused on the just transition, with a sense that actually that will develop the public, it will secure the industry support and the public support. Now, it's not enacted yet, so it remains to be seen how it's going to be delivered. And the other thing, of course, is that you're going to France. France is a country that has already had a national citizens' climate assembly. That's another innovation in terms of generating public participation in the decision-making process, as well as giving legitimacy for the policies which are adopted. Many of those policies, but not all, have been adopted by the French government. So I think that it's very helpful to see the work that you've done with the Net Zero Review as part of a new constellation of measures which need to be coming together, but also to learn from where their deficiencies have been. So that's just the kind of context for where you are now. If you'd like to respond to any of those thoughts, and I'm looking for hands to go up for questions and comments from the audience here.
I mean, I reckon every country, is going to have its own sort of pathway, and in a way, because we passed the Climate Change Act, that was the umbrella legislation that allowed me to take net zero forwards as an amendment to that act. We'd already committed to 80% emissions reduction on 1990 levels. Net zero was calculated to be 100% emissions reduction on 1990 levels, so we were able to amend the target. And obviously, we've had our Committee on Climate Change that was obviously established as part of that Climate Change Act. And what I was conscious with the Net Zero Review, and I think it's interesting for countries, is you've got the emissions reduction target, you've got potentially carbon budgets that you need to set, and that's important that we have a independent body to do that. And it wasn't my role as an elected politician really to question that or be involved in that. It was to run this sort of twin track process to sort of say, also, how can we just evaluate potentially where we could bring in investment which we're not receiving? How can we take an economic opportunity to climate strategy that's separate from the CCCs, focusing on the scientific emissions reduction as well? But I think France is a really good example because we had our own climate assembly in the UK. And the government sort of took its responded to it, but obviously didn't take all its recommendations on board. What I saw in the UK is actually some local authorities have run their own climate assemblies and did make that commitment. So Oxford had a climate assembly, but said from the very start, we will accept your recommendations. So we have seen that sort of come forward, and it's that challenge between national versus local. How do you give local areas the space to breathe, to do their own thing as well, which I also think is really important. And then there's just the question also around, if you're going to do the transition, how can you build in conditionality so that you make bargains that potentially you recognise that it can't just all be sticks. You've got to have the carrots as well. How do you create those incentive mechanisms? And obviously we've got the States, which is all focusing on incentives. We've got sort of Europe, which has got sort of more of the sticks. And it's that middle ground, I think, is the one where we need to do more work. Conditionality. So I always think France was a great example of where during COVID, they bailed out certain industries, notably the airlines industry, but did so only on the condition that they made targets to decarbonise. So it's a question of priorities. Making sure that governments don't miss those opportunities is equally important.
I'm not sure that the European Union would accept the characterization that the European Green Deal is just about sticks. I think, as you say, the thing is to find the balance between the incentives and the sanctions. I wonder, I know that in the audience we have colleagues who've worked in Mexico. Mexico was the second country after the UK which actually adopted a general framework law on climate change, and they've been going through their own review process, Andres, I'm just looking at you and wondering if you want to make a contribution in terms of the process that you've gone through, also auditing the success or not of measures under the Climate Change Act. I think it'd be very helpful for Chris to hear from you.
Thank you, Malini. Hi. We passed our law 2012 and have experienced some interesting reforms. The most important maybe 2018 when we included the then NDC. We have a new NDC, but we are now in the process precisely of updating the law again to include the new NDC last year, but the net zero target. That's what we are missing. We haven't even put it in a policy. We don't even have it in law. So I think your experience is really interesting. I don't think there are many countries in the world with the net zero law. And I was wondering, how politicized it became, the discussion in terms of parties, that some wanted, some didn't. and how you dealt with it, and how long did it take for the law to be approved and the process, private sector. I mean, that those experiences are very useful for us, as it was your law when we passed our law.
So, I mean, I think given that there was a process by which we had the Climate Change Act, which was supported cross-party. So the Conservative Party was in opposition in 2008, and we said we would support the Labour Party taking forward the Climate Change Act. And we asked them to go further. We said, don't do 60% emissions reduction, let's do 80%. And we built that sort of climate consensus. It was really important then for demonstrating the sort of long-term, whoever was going to be in government. The challenge now is obviously how do we ensure that politicians don't seek to play party politics with climate? How do we agree to, we're going to disagree over policy details and what incentives are going to be needed to encourage businesses and communities to decarbonise, but let's still agree to the overall outcome and the overall aim. And after net zero was passed into law, that there was a challenge, because I think people began to say, well, it wasn't in your manifesto to start with. So the Conservative Party had on page 1 of their manifesto in 2019. All the other political parties supported net zero in their manifestos also. So, and that's, I think, really for the British government and the civil service, having a manifesto commitment is, when you're a minister, that's sort of like gold-plated. You can then sort of say, look, this must happen because this is was agreed to at the election. I think the wider challenge now is some politicians on the right or on the extremes. We've had this challenge around in the last decade. If we can't, let's have a referendum. There's been this sort of on the voting system. Oh, let's have a referendum. We had Brexit. We had a referendum. Scottish independence. Oh, let's have a referendum. There's certain people who are now like, let's have a referendum on net zero. Why won't you let us have the choice? And that is a challenge, but that's obviously no different on any policy that someone disagrees with. They say, well, let's have a referendum. The challenge on net zero is obviously net zero is in itself a scientific concept that's quite difficult to translate across into explaining to the public what this is. If you reframe net zero into taking action to improve healthcare, taking action to rewild nature and improve forest habitats, people will then support it. Taking action on protecting and conserving the environment is number 4 on people's list. Even taking action on climate change. If you make it just about net zero, I think you're going to lose the argument. So it's how to recognise and bind in new opportunities to build consensus support for the future. And that's where I think the US has done a great job in. They're not like they're far behind the UK. Their target's only to 50% emissions reduction compared to our 68% or the 50% EVs. They're basically half of what our ambition is. Yet they've managed to frame the climate narrative as one of opportunity, as one of growth, as one of economic regeneration. And that's, I think, where we're living in at the moment, is that challenge is one that we should accept. We shouldn't shy away from it. We shouldn't sort of say, oh, populists are coming after net zero or coming after climate action. Let's meet that challenge by demonstrating where the public support will be. And the public support will be for those leaders who are out on the front foot making the case for why we need to do this. Why, if we don't do this, jobs will be lost. And that, I think, is what we should welcome challenge. I think that's the for people who sort of say, this is undemocratic, why are you doing this, why are you all meeting here, to take decisions on our behalf for our communities. Let's recognise that challenge and live up to it.
It's off again. Oh, there you go. So, Andres, you made a really important point, because, of course, even in Mexico, there is an legally binding net zero target. There are countries, Nigeria, for example, where there is a net zero date. India has a net zero date. Many countries do have net zero dates. And, in fact, companies will have net zero targets. Cities will have net zero targets. But in the absence of those, what is the totem? What do you go after? And I'm just looking at the Member of Parliament from Uganda. You, of course, have served on the committee for climate change and environment. And I'm just wondering, Uganda now has a climate change law. Your own experience in securing that buy-in that you're talking about to ensure that once you have the act, you're in a position to be able to deliver.
Thank you so much. He's also a member of parliament from Uganda as well, and he has ever chaired the Environment and Natural Resources Committee. But based on that, thank you very much for sharing with us. I got a chance and visited your parliament, and I saw how you conducted, you deal with the budgeting, especially for the opposition side. Because I'm the Shadow Minister for Water and Environment, and I was so impressed at how you allocate budgets to the other side in the implementation of climate-related initiatives. And so, the concept of net zero, I hope you are convinced that implementation of net zero may not be effective in your home country alone. You also have to consider other countries in helping you meet the targets. For example, carbon offsetting. UK alone may not be able to offset all your emissions. You'll have to deal with other countries to help you out. Other countries like Uganda. So, now, other countries, Uganda, the speed at which they expect you to come to us, to come to them, is too high. Our side is like we don't want voluntary business. Yeah? We don't want scanty business. Yet that is what is provided for in some of these negotiations. So I wanted to know how you plan to implement net zero with the rest of the world, based on your selection on who is going to help you do that. And then the other challenge we have in Uganda, we have the Climate Change Act, fine. But how often do you remind the government that we are doing badly now? Let's increase on this. As parliaments, we need to get, how do you monitor and now wake up the government, remind them that, this is astray. Now, that is our challenge. We have put the policies in place, and we are aware that it is us to put the government on target, but when do you do it? Yeah, that is my challenge.
The point around international cooperation and responsibility and delivering on net zero. So the UK government, and this doesn't have to be the position of every country, obviously, now we've seen the completion of Article 6 in the Paris Rulebook, that there potentially is the opportunity for international carbon markets, carbon trading. But the UK government's been very clear that it won't meet its net zero commitment through offsets. Its commitment is to decarbonising in real terms. But that's not to obviously say that, when it comes to UK industries and private companies, that they shouldn't necessarily be given opportunity to help grow carbon markets internationally. And I think this is going to be a really important sort of outcome of COP28, is the future development now, well, pretty much the final development of the standards from the Voluntary Carbon Markets Initiative and elsewhere, to making sure that if we're going to help other countries support emissions reduction in addition to their own emissions reduction, how can we make sure that those countries don't embark on a process that is then going to be found to be deficient later on? How do we ensure that there's not double counting? How do we ensure that the methodology that's in place is going to help the countries receive the investment they deserve, and it's sustainable, that it's going to continue? I think my worry, I said, don't overpromise and under-deliver, but also how do you make sustainability sustainable? Make sure that this isn't just an initiative that then dies off. We haven't got enough time for that. So embedding long-term strategic planning and relationships with specific countries. We've got certain countries now setting out their own transition plans, how we can support that. My review had a chapter on international engagement, where I wanted a strategic review to be conducted where the UK would set out its international climate leadership, because I think that's incredibly important, that we help support other countries on their plans. but we also help those countries build up the carbon markets that can then potentially create a new economy. So I think that's really important. Then on accountability and those points which you hold the government to account. So we've got a two-pronged. I mean, we had the select committee here earlier. We have the Committee on Climate Change produce an annual progress report, and they basically mark the government's homework and say exactly how far the government is off track, both from its carbon budgets, but also where it is in terms of the investment, the number of people that are getting a heat pump, or the number of people who have insulation, the number of people taking up electric vehicles, the number of electric charge points. All that is monitored in a big, thick book that sort of comes out, and then it's for parliamentarians like myself and Therese to say, well, this is what the Committee on Climate Change has said. But there's not really, apart from that annual process, as well as also then the select committee process, a means by which to delve deeper. And actually, this is something that Rishi Sunak, the UK Prime Minister, wants to address, and I support him on this, which is we're going to take forward our next carbon budget 7. So we're beginning to look now at what happens from 2034 onwards. That's how far we are in terms of setting an agenda and preparing business and industry. So what he wants to do is have greater parliamentary engagement on the carbon budgets, because I think the last carbon budget 6 that was signed into law in 2021 during COP26, we obviously wanted to sign our carbon budget into place because it also guaranteed our legislative commitment to our NDC for 2030, 68% emissions reduction, 78% emissions reduction for 2035. So we sort of said, we're going to pass it into law and get the carbon budget signed into place. But that debate was only half an hour. And I think the Prime Minister said it's not acceptable that such big decisions should have that lack of parliamentary scrutiny. So I don't know what he's going to suggest, but if he suggests that it increases parliamentary scrutiny, the MPs get more time to debate these issues, I think that will be more healthy, and hopefully maybe the MPs will have an annual opportunity also to look again at where we are, but making sure we do so in a positive way that is a ratchet mechanism upwards rather than a race to the bottom going backwards.
I'd like to call on the former Secretary of State, Therese Coffey, for the environment. And Therese, Mike, I have a question actually, which has been prompted by this discussion that you may also wish to respond to. So Christine Kaya, Member of Parliament from Uganda, mentioned that there obviously has to be accountability for offsets, which are being sought to be secured outside of the borders of the country in question. And Chris, you came back to it by saying, well, we're not trying to do that at the UK government level. But of course, there are companies who will be seeking to do it. And you mentioned the Voluntary Carbon Markets Initiative. Now, I was listening to Rachel Kite recently, who is one of the initiators and co-chairs of that initiative. And she challenged governments and saying, well, the reason that we are voluntary is because governments have not taken it upon themselves to set very clearly what the rules of engagement are for companies which are involved in carbon offsets. So I'm wondering, again, it's this ping pong between the external stakeholders, those who are coming up with initiatives, and then coming back to parliaments and to the executive and saying, make the rules, set very clear guidelines and safeguards. So whether you may wish to respond to that, or shall I just pass directly to you, Therese, on that? And then come back directly to you.
If you want to come up and introduce yourself, I think you should come up to the stage in a moment. But in terms of that, what we did in the review, specifically on the voluntary carbon markets, again, you've got these international standards that are being developed. Also, the International Standards Sustainability Board, the ISSB, again, creating international standards for transition plans. What I tried to say is the government should support these, and when they are ready, the government should then implement these. And take forward their recommendations, and that was what we tried to sort of frame this in the review, is that there's no point of us like reinventing the wheel 180 times for every different country. The international standards provide the benchmarking by which then we need to trade, we need to have a framework by which business and industry can cooperate, and so the government should make those commitments. So that was where sort of we wanted to really sort of set that pace, that we should get the government to adopt them, and I think they will do. Is obviously the government's challenge. They want to make sure they can see what's written down on the page before they actually sign off on it.
Building on what Chris has just said, and by the way, it was a joy to serve in government with Chris, and I've recently left government about 3 weeks ago. But the broad point I was going to make is that how we approached it in the United Kingdom was to have that long term. And once you put something into legislation, it's actually quite difficult to get rid of it. And that's the reason why those long-term approaches are important. The other thing that Chris started to refer to is that within our legislation, we set carbon budgets to work on the long term. And where some of the successful legal cases have come into play is where perhaps there hasn't been the confidence set out in our approach to achieve a particular carbon budget has then been deemed unlawful. And that's been brought by external bodies in order to challenge the UK government to that approach. I think a key thing was about the establishment of this separate independent body, again through legislation, called the Committee for Climate Change. And where I don't know if I do disagree with Chris on this, but where I started to get concerned as a government minister until recently is that the Committee for Climate Change was almost starting to really be upset that the government did not agree with their views on how to achieve a carbon budget outcome. So, for example, we were being advised to have a proactive campaign to change people's diet and to get them to eat less meat. I didn't, as the Secretary of State at the time, I didn't think this was the right approach. I thought there were other things that we could do, and I disagreed with them. But on that basis, even now, the UK government is facing a legal case because we didn't take the advice for the Committee for Climate Change. So I think it's really important that these statutory bodies who employ experts, unlike, dare I say it, Parliament, who've got a limited range of experts to help advise members of Parliament. Of course, governments have thousands of civil servants to do all this work. Well, they do in the UK. They may not have quite so much in other parts of the world. I accept that. But at the moment, there's an imbalance, and that's where the independent body who can acquire all this knowledge, can do this analysis. That's a really important relationship to have, to be able to access that. But personally, I still believe Parliament are the people who should decide. And as Chris has just suggested, I agree we need to spend more time debating the policies on how we achieve the carbon budget, but also for Parliament to hold to account government rather than just NGOs taking the government to court and it being deemed unlawful. So I think there's still more to come. Climate Change Act is still, it's only 15 years old. It's achieved a hell of a lot. It's been updated. I remember Chris signing the legislation that made it 100% net zero. And even now, there have been some further changes, I think, or maybe when you were the minister, Chris, that initially we didn't include aircraft emissions. And there's still more we might need to do with shipping emissions. But in terms of understanding what businesses are doing around the country, around the world in the offsets, I think that's something where there will need to be global standards. There are companies or organisations that try and accredit that. But it may be the next phase for the UNF and CCC to decide. But I think, candidly, there are further things, and one of my hopes through my time now as a backbencher not in the government is to try and come forward with ideas that perhaps I wasn't successful in getting all of government agreement on, whether that's in the greenhouse gas inventory, frankly rewarding countries for their biodiversity and their sequestration through nature-based solutions, which they simply don't at the moment, and the global mechanisms don't allow it. So that's where I'll be spending my time of trying to hold the government to account, but also organisations like UNF CCC on how we can make that movement too. And that's where working with parliamentarians from around the world, it's really useful to try and get that being a key priority of negotiation mandates for other countries as well as our own in taking that forward. And that's where I hope parliaments around the world, as I say, can start to hold their governments to account and not necessarily decide the mandate, or that may be the tradition in other countries, but to be clear what the mandate is and how we finalise and deliver on the mandate that's eventually committed to by the countries from around the world. I hope that's helpful.
That is very, very helpful, and thank you for being so candid also. Indeed, the ambition, the challenge for ambition to be raised is not going to go away, because we're at COP, and one of the expectations is that in order for us to actually meet the global 2050 net zero target, that industrialized countries are going to have to revise their own targets to meet them not at 2050 but 2040. So it's one of the expectations for the next round of NDC reviews. So the work that you're doing, I think, is going to be put in even sharper focus this coming year, isn't it? So, Chris, your last words just to round off this conversation.
Thank you so much for attending and expressing interest in this sort of net zero review process that the UK government's taken forward. It was really just to say, if anyone is interested in having further conversations, I'm keen to share the learning and the process, and I'm sure also in the British government, the department itself would also be willing to engage on any support we can provide. Again, I'm keen to make sure that we use this COP to highlight best practice, and it doesn't matter which country it comes from. Carbon dioxide knows no borders, and we've all got this opportunity to work together. And if one country finds a solution faster than anyone else, let's make sure that we can all roll that solution out as fast as possible. From a perspective of thinking about policy frameworks, that's what I hope the Net Zero Review of Mission Zero is able to do for other countries, not just the UK.